Here's problem 2710. Most telephone cables are made of copper wire of either 24 or 26 gauge. If the resistance of 24 gauge wire is 137 ohms per mile and the resistance of 26 gauge wire is 220 ohms per mile, what is the ratio of the diameter of 24 gauge wire to that of 26 gauge wire? Usually as gauges go, the lower the number, the thicker the wire. So we would expect that the 24 gauge wire is thicker than the 26 gauge wire. Alright, so what are we given? We're given, actually given, we know that resistance is resistivity times length over area. And in this case we are actually given the resistance per length of, say, the 26 gauge wire, and that was equal to 220 ohms per mile. So that should be equal to the resistivity of the material over the cross-sectional area of the 26 gauge wire. Also, we have the resistance of the 24 gauge wire per length, and that is equal to 137, and that should be equal to the resistance of the copper over the cross-sectional area of the 24 gauge. If I were to divide these two equations, I would get 220 divided by 137 is equal to, and then the resistivity would cancel out, and I would end up with the cross-sectional area of the 24 gauge to the cross-sectional area of the 26 gauge wire. So the cross-sectional area of the 24 gauge wire to the cross-sectional area of the 26 gauge should be equal to pi times the radius of the 24 gauge wire squared over pi times the radius of the 26 gauge wire squared. And that is equal to 220 divided by 137. So what is that? 220 divided by 137 is 1.606. Alright, in this equation, the pi's cancel out, and so we have the radius of the 24 gauge to the 26 gauge squared is 1.606. So if I were to take the square root of both sides, I would then get that the radius of the 24 gauge to the 26 gauge is equal to the square root of 1.606, and that is 1.267. That is the ratio of the radiuses of these two wires, the 24 gauge to the 26 gauge. We want the diameters. Well, the diameter of the 24 gauge is just 2 times the radius of the 24 gauge, and so is the diameter of the 26 gauge is 2 times the radius of the 26 gauge. So the ratio of the diameters is the same as the ratio of the radiuses. So that is equal to 1.267, and hence the 24 gauge wire has a greater diameter than the 26 gauge wire, and the ratio is 1.267.